Cool. So first of all, I just want to say some thank yous. These are not all my trees. I wish they were, but Larry brought many of these in. Some of them are his trees. Some of them are from the Denver Botanic Gardens collection. So thanks, Larry. I also want to thank Therese. She drove me here. I did something to my back. I think I herniated a disc or something, so I'm kind of like stiff tonight. So thanks. So yeah, native Colorado species for bonsai, but actually it's Southern Rocky Mountains, because many of these species I'll talk about grow in Wyoming and the Snowy Range and even further north. And then New Mexico has a lot of these species, so this is a more specific title. Move to here? Oh, okay. So this is the show last year, and I think this is about right. I got this from the spreadsheet I think David provided, but 85 total bonsai, almost 45% were Colorado natives. And those were broken down into mostly ponderosa. Well, ponderosa pine was the most common tree in the show at about 13%, then Rocky Mountain juniper, Colorado blue spruce, and then we had some others, tropicals, top right, and then, well, let me tell you who these are. So anyway, 45% natives, a bunch of tropicals, and then only 8.2% traditional Japanese species. Top left is Patrick Allen's ponderosa pine. I think this is Adams. Make sure I'm right, Adam. Adams Rocky Mountain juniper. Matt Wright had a really nice Colorado blue spruce, the bottom left. Christina Carfora Seaman had a Brazilian rain tree, is that right? A stunning tree, top right. Lou de Herrera had this really nice Portulacaria. And then Walter Buck had this trident maple, traditional Japanese species forest. And then I don't know if anybody saw this one in the show, this begonia by Zach Jones. That was an amazing tree to me, but non-traditional species. And I would say, I think this is kind of the breakdown you usually see in our shows. About half natives, a bunch of tropicals, especially ficus, and not that many traditional Japanese species. And I think there's a good reason. So I like traditional Colorado native species for a number of reasons. One of the first ones is they're adapted to our climate already. So you're not fighting an uphill battle trying to winter your Japanese maple outside if you don't have a greenhouse, or Japanese black pines don't really do well if it gets down to 20 below, something like that. So you're not swimming upstream with the Colorado native. Many are abundant and easy to obtain. A lot of people in the society have good expertise on growing these things, so there's a body of knowledge. But for me, the biggest thing is I like to look at trees in the wild as my models for bonsai, rather than in a magazine or a book about, Japanese species. That's personal. I love Japanese species, but I like to look at trees in nature. Why not, though? All our native trees are pretty slow growing, so don't expect, like if you have a Japanese black pine that's a multi-flush pine that you can just grow from seed in 20 years, have a pretty nice little shohin tree. It's not going to happen. They are slow growing, mostly. And for some species, and I'll talk about some of these like sagebrush or currant, there's not a lot of expertise on them, so you just can't ask somebody and expect to know everything there is to know, although that's a fun part too, right? Because you can explore that and come up with, or add to the knowledge of natives. So when I first started bonsai in 1990, I did the little Bonsai juniper, actually a course here in Denver Botanic Gardens. But this is what I wanted to do. I looked at the magazines and like, oh, this is what I want. And 15 years I'll have that. That was my model for bonsai. That's changed entirely. To me now, these look very formulaic. And I still love them, but this is not what I want. I like the trees in nature. The aspens, these are, Yeah, this is a windy spot where the aspens, when they get up top, it almost looks like, have you seen bald cypress? When they do that, they grow real tall and then they branch out at top like that. Ponderosa pines. One of my goals is to grow a formal upright ponderosa pine that looks like a ponderosa pine. I haven't ever seen one in one of our shows, by the way. And then limber pine on the right. So those are my models, and that's what I want to do. I don't know if you guys have like set goals in mind for your bonsai collection, but right now mine is don't get any bigger. I would like to get one bonsai of each species of a Colorado native. That's hard to do, and model them after trees in the wild. These are the sources for a lot of the stuff in this presentation. This guy, E.L. Little, a lot of the maps you see online of where trees grow in North America were done by this guy. I think he was with USGS. The gymnosperm database. How many people use that? Anybody know about that? 1, 2. It's an online resource. You can just look it up, gymnosperm database, but it has all the conifers in North America in it. It's a really nice thing. It'll tell you ecology, ethnobotany, distribution maps, all that. I'm really into pines. This is a great book on the ecology and biogeography of that group. This Flora of Colorado, and this came up. It's by Jennifer Ackerfield. It's relatively new. What's her position here at the Gardens? Do you know?
I can't remember the exact title, but she's in charge of the collections.
Botanist in charge kind of thing.
Yeah. You got the collections of pressed plants, whatever that's called.
Yeah. So she's really good. It's a great book if you don't have it and you're interested in the flora of Colorado. And then Bonsai Mirai is something that I've been a member of for a while. There's some really good stuff on there. But another source, when I started bonsai, I did it on my own. It wasn't until I joined RMBS that I really feel like I started to gain knowledge and get better and better. And it's from people in here who, many of them are still members here, but that's the way to learn. Somebody said that earlier, with members of the society, a club that can share with you. And I think RMBS is one of those clubs that has a real tradition of sharing and not competing. And then finally, some of my personal experience. I try to acknowledge anybody whose photos are in here that I didn't take. A lot of them are from Mike Green, who does photographs for our show. But I'll acknowledge those. Most of them I'd say are mine. Okay, if you want to do natives, where do you get these things? And we can talk more as we go, but there are nurseries that specialize in natives. Sometimes nursery plants aren't that suitable for bonsai, or you have to have a lot of patience. Like, it's going to take you 5 or 10 years to develop an aspen that comes in a 5-gallon pot into a bonsai like this aspen here. But you can do it. There's reputable collectors. These are 3 that I think are good and do it ethically and sustainably. RMBS members, Ron said, we have an auction coming, and I often donate trees to the auction. Other people will do that, collected trees that you can get, and then you can collect yourself. I'm going to not go and read this or anything. This is the RMBS position on collecting. Basically, it says get permission from the landowner, land manager. And the second part I think is most important, and that is have respect for the trees. You shouldn't collect if you don't think that tree is going to survive. You're kind of taking it on. It's like adopting a pet. So do it ethically and with a strong sense that it's going to survive. Walter Paul has this video that's really good if you're into collecting, want to learn it. He makes a strong case that if you can't repot and have ultimate confidence that you can take a tree from a pot like this and put it in another pot and it'll survive, you shouldn't be digging one up. So collecting is good, and but you got to do it right. Go back?
Yeah, well, I didn't get all that.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I think David's going to make this available online, but, and actually you could probably just search on YouTube Walter Paul Yamadori collecting, but did you get it?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Again, respect for the trees is paramount. These trees on the left, I think this is the Backcountry Boys. They collect some amazing trees. They've been doing it for years. They know how to do it. You shouldn't be trying to collect those. I wouldn't try to collect those. But you can get young trees like this bristlecone on the right. There's lots of them. They're pretty easy to collect. And this is an example. This was a young one I collected 4 years ago. So if you do collect and you're new at it, go for young trees. They're a lot more likely to survive, and there's a lot more of them. Don't try to collect something like that middle one that's, 500 years old? I wouldn't do it. It's just such it's a resource that is irreplaceable. And I should say, if anybody has comments, suggestions, says, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, go ahead and bring it up. As an ecologist, I use these terms, and I'll use it throughout the presentation for describing where these plants grow. But plains, obvious. On the east, where the plains transition into the mountains, it's the foothills. Montane is an ecological word for that low elevation, like 5,000 to 9,000 foot ponderosa Doug fir zone. Subalpine is below tree line and above montane, and then alpine, technically there's no trees there. A lot of people will say, oh, alpine just means mountains, but an ecological term is alpine is above tree line. Are those new terms to anybody, or everybody know those? I shouldn't even put this up here. All right, and just to make it interesting, I threw some misconceptions up there that I'll address during the show, but partly I wanted to see if I could get a reaction from you guys, or a rise out of you on some of these. So one that is really important, and you'll get to know if you do Colorado natives as bonsai, is what is good for a limber pine or bristlecone in the wild is not necessarily good for them in a pot. It's a whole different thing. And I'll talk a little more about that. Another one is that, and you hear this all the time, well, that doesn't look like a bristlecone, or that doesn't look like a limber pine. Each species has multiple forms, and I'll show you some examples of that. But there isn't one ponderosa or, one Rocky Mountain juniper. This is one. Snow is a stressor and a huge negative impact on trees in the Rockies. Snow is really important, but it's a real benefit to most trees. And I don't think that it's as, a lot of people say, oh, break branches, and, that's why these trees look so messed up sometimes. And snow is really a positive for most montane and subalpine trees in Colorado, in my opinion. Another one is that fire is bad for pines. Fire has driven pines, and I'll talk more about it. And then this last one is that the old trees are always asymmetrical. That's not true, and I'll show you some examples. Okay, so that first one I was talking about, that what's good for a tree in the wild is good for a tree as a bonsai. It's not because you've taken that root system that might, a juniper, some junipers have root systems that go 50, 60 feet. And you're taking it and you're putting it in a little pot like this. It makes it a whole different world. It doesn't have a giant reservoir for water, so you have to water those things every day, right? So that's one reason. Another one is that when you take a tree out of the wild, out of a woodland or a forest, put it on your bonsai bench and you give it all the light it needs, all the water it needs, it doesn't have any competition. So really, a limber pine's a good example again. The reason they grow in these high altitude places where there's no water, it's because they don't compete well for light at all. And they can't survive. So they're pushed to the edges by spruce and bristlecones and things like that. So eliminating competition, giving them all they want, it makes it a different thing growing a tree in a pot versus in the wild. And then the other thing is that when you have this pot on your bench, it's susceptible to high heat in the summer and low cold in the winter. It's just up and down. So it's just a different thing. Here's a pinyon pine. They are the most drought tolerant of all pines, but if you put them in a pot and you don't water it for 2 weeks, it's going to die. It needs water every day, probably during the summertime. Here's another one. It's subalpine fir, grows at 12,500 feet sometime. This tree I had in Longmont, I wintered it outside, but it came out of dormancy about this time, and it was growing really well. And I thought, it's a subalpine fir, it'll be fine. First frost, every new bud died. So it's different. When you put it in a pot, take it out of the forest, you've got to protect it. All right. Everybody know how many pines we have in Colorado? 6. Has everybody seen every pine in Colorado? Or put it this way, has everyone seen a southwestern white pine in Colorado? I see a few people. I've never been able to see one, but I haven't looked in the Southwest. So there's 6 species. I won't spend much time on this slide because I have the information further on, but pinyon, ponderosa, limber pine, southwest white, lodgepole, and bristlecone. And I think we have everyone except for southwestern white, and I forgot to bring my my lodgepole. The second misconception I had, that fire is bad for pines. This is from that book I was telling you. Essentially, fire is why pines still exist in the world, because once angiosperms, broadleaf trees came about, they're much more efficient, and pines had to go to these marginal places where there's fire, where there's wind, where there's arid conditions, or they just can't compete with oaks, beech, any of the broadleaf trees. And in Colorado, 2 of the pines, lodgepole and ponderosa, are what ecologists call fire-dependent species, especially lodgepole. But ponderosa too, they thrive where fire is. Fire kills their competitors, so they do the best there. And in my experience, bristlecones and limber pines, almost every time I go hiking in those areas, I find signs of fire. And I believe what happens is fire, yes, it'll kill the bristlecones, but what comes in, more bristlecones, and it eliminates competitors like Engelmann spruce, which are much better competitors for light. But pinyon, especially, it's killed by fire. It doesn't do very well with fire. And then I put Rocky Mountain bristlecone and limber on this side too, because they are killed, but I think that once a fire comes in, it regenerates into bristlecone and pinyon, or in limber. All right. This is the one that's the most common in our shows, about 12, 13%. It's the iconic pine of the West. And this is the habitat, you see it, orangish platy bark, and it smells like vanilla. That's the distribution map on the top right. It is the widest distribution of a North American pine. There's different subspecies. Let's see what else. Ours is Pinus ponderosa scopulorum, which means of the rocks. Foothills in montane, so 4,500 to 9,500. And you often see it with Doug fir and a lot of times with Rocky Mountain juniper. I'd love to see this tallest tree 121 feet in Colorado, but there's some out west that are nearly 300 feet. Let's see what else. And the oldest recommended or documented, and this is from the gymnosperm database, is 907 years. And they benefit from low intensity wildfires. So this picture on the bottom right is Valles Caldera. I don't know if you've been there in New Mexico. If you haven't, it's just a wonderful place. But, well, did you ever watch Longmire, that show? That's where his cabin is, even though the show was filmed in Wyoming. But fire repeatedly in those systems kills all the shrubs, kills all the competing, Gamble oak or Rocky Mountain juniper. So you end up with that beautiful Ponderosa parkland. And do you all recognize what fire scars look like on these trees? So if you see these triangular scars, the one on the right is pretty obvious because there's still some, but those are fire scars. On the left here, you see these old trees with fire scars, but see all the young trees are about the same age? They probably came in with a fire that burned and caused that fire scar. A lot of times in this area, the fire scars are small like that. And you can date the fire. If you were to cut this tree down, you can count the rings from the dead wood in and then from the living wood out and get the fire date. And many of them will have 2 and 3 and 4 fires. So that's how dendrochronologists and fire ecologists can date fires. They have this thick platy bark that protects them from low intensity fires. And this was a tree near our house that burned a year and a half, 2 years ago now. But it killed and it scorched all the foliage. It died, but you can see that it came out the next year. And it's probably doing fine right now. I haven't looked at it again, but this was a year after that fire. Let's see, forms. And like I said, they have different forms. These are tall, mature trees. That's a Rio Chama in New Mexico. In the Front Range here, a lot of the biggest pines growing on steep hillsides at the base of rocks. And what's going on is that those rocks get water and they shuttle it down or funnel it down to the big trees. So some of the biggest ones you see in Colorado will be on the base of rocks like that. If you go out into Estes Park, many of them in open areas or on ridges will have fires or a lightning scar like that. And that would make a really nice bonsai if you could find a tree that was this tall like that. This is one in near us, and I'm going to go measure it. I think it might be broader in diameter than the record one in Colorado, but this is a different form. It's multi-trunks. Like each of those, I think it's 6 trunks, and each one's like that big at the base where it branches out. And if you get even higher on poorer soils, do you guys know what this tree is, or what species this is, or what would you think it is? Looks like a bristlecone or a limber. It's a ponderosa, and it's just probably around 9,000 feet. It's a harsh habitat, lots of wind, and it's starting to approach bristlecone and limber in appearance. And of course, what do we use for bonsai? This is what we want to collect because they're small. But does it really look like a ponderosa? I don't know. It's a different form of a ponderosa. In my view, this is more like a Japanese bonsai when we take it and we try to shape it like I'm doing with this bristlecone, trying to make it, look like those Japanese trees. Anybody having comments about this?
So how old would those be, though? When you've already said we shouldn't disturb older trees. Those look pretty old.
They are. And let me amend that. I think we shouldn't disturb them unless we have permission and we know they're going to survive and we know we're going to take care of them. I will bet you, and Larry can weigh in, or Bert, 200, 300, 400 years old, maybe. Adam, what do you guys think?
The middle one's probably really young, because it's growing in good soil.
I can't say who's saying it, but I hear what you're saying. It's growing in good soil, and the middle one's probably a little younger. That's kind of a cork bark look to it, too. Go ahead.
So I think these kind of do grow in nature, though, like the ones, they almost look like bush style ones, kind of, almost their own style, because you see these ones growing in like the rocks that don't get tall at all, but they're almost their own style because they are in nature.
I agree, they're their own style, and you do see a lot of them. They're always on these nasty places if you're a pine, not much soil.
I've taken many slices from trees and counted annual rings, and you have to do it with a microscope. And the trend on ponderosas is about 125 annual rings to the radial inch on a tree that's in a distressed environment like the
Yeah.
plus or minus 10 annual rings either way.
Yeah. I think
So you can calculate the circumference or the diameter and take half of that, there's your radius, that's where this, somewhere in there is the central point, and count from there.
Did everybody hear that? Yeah, they're old. You should respect them. Well, maybe very old. I didn't mean that in a funny way. They are old and we should respect them, for sure. Okay, as bonsai, strengths, they're really vigorous once you get them in a bonsai pot. If you take care of them, they grow really well. Collected trees have that great movement, great deadwood, the flaky bark, and they have this patina of age. Oh, that's a repeat, isn't it? Oh, no. So this is getting back to what we were talking about. Is this ponderosa pine in the upper right a true representation of the species? I'm not sure. That's one of mine. And your point was good, that there are those trees in the wild. I will say this, though. You hardly ever see those little twisted trees like that with cones, and I don't think they reproduce. I think they're kind of dead ends.
So that's something to like keep into consideration if you are collecting trees. Maybe look for ones that won't reproduce because they're not really helping the ecosystem too much. I mean, they're definitely there, and they're hundreds of years old.
Right, so ecologically, if you select trees that aren't going to reproduce, you're probably not having an effect. I'd counter, though, that I like seeing those trees in the wild, and I wouldn't want to be the person to take one out and it dies, and someone else couldn't appreciate. Or I'll tell you another story. There's a place near us. It's a small BLM parcel. There are all these small ponderosas on it, and I knew a guy, and he's like, "Oh, I've been there." And I said, "Oh, so have you collected? Because I haven't seen many in there." He said, "Oh, I took 150 trees out of there." And I'm like, different than me. I'm not going to say I wouldn't do that. So again, it gets back to respect, and it's a non-sustainable resource. So everybody has to make their own decision. So you can do it legally. You can get permits from district offices of the Forest Service and BLM. This tree on the bottom right, did that win? Was that the one that won at the ABS? Larry, do you remember Dusty's?
He did have one that won before.
Oh, maybe it was a different one.
One of Dusty's.
This one is one of the best ponderosas I've ever seen. That he had that in the show 3 years ago, I think. Anyway, these are some of my trees, but they get this old look, flaky bark, beautiful deadwood, and a lot of times they have those twists. Weakness is they have long needles. And I'd say maybe 15 years ago, at least in the broader bonsai world, people was like, ponderosa pines, they'll never be any good. I think Rocky Mountain junipers were thought of as the same way. But there are techniques to reduce needles, so I think they're awesome trees for bonsai. They are slow growing, and sometimes it's hard to get them to back bud. All right, this is going to maybe raise some discussion here. When I first started, the recommendation was use turfus as an important part of your mix and mix it with sorted bark or decomposed granite or shale, things like that. And then water it sparingly because you don't want to get those long needles, and don't fertilize until the tree needles have hardened off. And then I wasn't having great luck with them. I planted it in that kind of mix. That's a ponderosa pine there. And then I came to RMBS, and Michael Hagedorn did a presentation, and this is what he said. If you have it, don't use it up by adding a little bit. Give it away, pay someone to take it. And and if you don't know who he has studied in Japan. He's got some amazing trees. He's in Portland, Oregon. But what convinced me was turfus is on the top right. He did an experiment. He had a number of ponderosa pines in turfus with other stuff, and a number in akadama, which is a Japanese clay soil. And he showed pictures, and his roots looked just like mine. And my trees were not doing very well, so I changed. So here's one of my trees after switching to akadama upon repotting, and they're just fine roots everywhere. I'll show you some more pictures of it. He's sort of mellowed out, so you can go online and see what he says now. But a number of these guys that studied in Japan will say this. And of course, they studied in Japan, and that's where akadama's from. But I don't use it. I think it's not good for the way I water, for Colorado natives. But, I know people who've used turfus for years and still do. They have wonderful trees. And so, if it works, you should do that. But you got to make sure it dries and aerates well before you water again. And then the only other thing I'd say is if you're a beginner at bonsai, or if you have trees and you can't keep your pines alive or the roots look like that when you repot, try akadama in your mix. It's expensive, but you really don't need that much. And I think it works really well. Anybody want to contribute or speak for turfus, maybe?
Not speaking for turfus, but have you tried just pure akadama with ponderosa, and how do they respond?
I have, so I have one on a rock, and it's pure akadama. The rock is not like a pot that air comes in on all sides, and I think for me, anything I'm going to put on a rock like that, if it's not a convex rock, I'm going to put in pure akadama because akadama holds water better. It also lets water out better. In other words, some clay, since the particles are so small and fine, tree roots can't get in there and pull it out. I read some study that said 25% of the water in clay, if it's fine particles, is inaccessible to plant roots in mycorrhiza. So mostly, though, I think pines like it drier. So I use a 1-1-1 pumice, scoria, or lava rock and akadama. But again, if turfus works for you, you should use it. Anybody use turfus that works really well, and how does it work for you? How do you water?
I water all of my plants the same way because my soil is all pretty much the same. And the most important characteristic is it's stable over a long period of time and doesn't break down like akadama does. My opinion of Mike Hagedorn, who I know well, and he would laugh when I tell Dennis he's an idiot for saying something like that with a test that's got only 2 or 3 plants in it. We use it here at the gardens in all of our mixes for annuals and perennials. I use it in my mix, but only as a component with many other things. And it works great. So to close out quickly here, I would suggest that the society needs to have a program on the opinion of soil. And let everybody talk about what we all think is important.
I have an alternative to that, and I want to do it this year, is when we go to the shows, I see lots of great trees, lots of great ponderosa pines, Rocky Mountain junipers. I think a really objective way to do this would be talk to Patrick, he's got a good ponderosa, and Adam, and Daryl, see who's using what. But one of the things about this whole debate is you can't take the soil component and say, oh, we're just going to isolate that. It has to do with how you water, has to do with the kind of pots you have, has to do where you're growing. Are you at 8,000 feet? Or, there are so many variables. So, yeah, it's a tough nut. But again, if it works for you and you have great trees, why would you change?
Exactly.
Yep.
So a more interesting question would be, how does the plant look? How's it doing?
Yep. And I'll say this too, listening to Ryan Neal, who's also Japanese trained apprentice, one of the things he says about akadama, and I agree with him, is it breaks down as the roots ramify, and that's reflected in the ramification above and below. And so instead of saying, oh, it turns to mush, it's like, oh, it breaks down because the roots are penetrating that akadama. Yeah. And
I've been doing some experiments though. I take akadama, just freeze it,
yeah.
thaw it, freeze it, thaw it, 4 times, half the akadama is gone.
Yep.
Because it just breaks down so fast. I think one of the things we have to think about being in Colorado is we have a lot more freeze thaw cycles than they do in
That's a good point.
Oregon.
I don't know if you all heard that, but freeze thaw is important in Colorado and not so in Japan or Oregon. But again, I know Adam has some of the best trees I've ever seen. I think he uses a lot of akadama. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. And the backcountry boys have some amazing trees. They're using akadama too. David's got a point.
Well, the other thing I would say is it seems like one thing people never speak about is that there are varying qualities of akadama.
That's a really good point.
I have akadama that I can put between my fingers and rub it. I have other akadama that I can put between my fingers and rub it, and it stays integrated. So there's a quality aspect to the akadama you're using that's very important.
Absolutely, that's a good point. And Tom?
One of the things that Ryan says about 20 times in any lecture that he gives is that the success of most trees is dependent on the balance of
Water and
oxygen and water. So, soil components are one thing, but how you water and the way and the soil composition, the elements in that soil composition that contribute to that balance is really important.
That's absolutely right. If you didn't hear it, roots need oxygen, they need water. The balance is what's important, regardless of the components. Ron?
I think the size of the akadama part is critical as well, particularly as the tree gets older.
Absolutely. Size is important of the particles. Okay, I think we better cut this off and we can duel after the program. Oh, here's a ponderosa pine on pure akadama because it's on a rock. And I water this thing 2 and 3 times a day. I live at 8,500 feet. It freezes almost every night until, mid-June? And anyway, so the Boone mix is the pumice scoria akadama. Well-sorted particles, somebody pointed out. Depends on the tree size. So if you have a small tree, small particles, big tree, big particles. If you have a water-loving species, so this isn't just ponderosa pines, this is any Colorado native, the way I see it, is if it's aspen, this aspen is in pure akadama. And if it's not a water-loving species, this is a bristlecone 111 pumice lava akadama. And then, like I say, on slabs or something, it gets a lot of air, more akadama. Needle reduction, as I said, people thought ponderosa wouldn't make a good bonsai, especially people who had a Japanese background. So this is a modest tree I collected, more than 9 years ago. Again, getting back, you don't need to collect something like this. That's probably 300 years old to start this limber pine. You can collect something like that and turn it into something good over time. But it's got akadama. Larry has a book about ponderosa pine that talks about a fall Japanese black pine technique for reducing needles. I've done that on this tree. Small pot, you don't repot them too often. If you do that, you're rejuvenating the soil, and it's got a lot of resources and the needles get long. And then just time. This tree, which I meant to bring in but I couldn't, I moved it up to fluorescent. Now we're at 8,500 feet and it's a short growing season. I think that helps those needles get short. So this is that tree after I took it from a big pot, put it in a little pot. Again, akadama that has really nice roots. And that's a progression of the tree over time. So these needles now on this ponderosa are an inch or less in length, to the point where people say, oh, that's not really a ponderosa. And this is Larry's book. Is it still available, Larry?
No.
No.
Unfortunately. Second printing is out and there's no plans.
There's a lot of really good information on that. I don't think I'll go over that because I still have a bunch of species to get through. Sources, collected material, as I said, RMBS members who might be selling at an auction or you want to trade with. Reputable collectors. Now, First Branch is Todd Schlafer. He used to sell trees. Backcountry Boys do sell trees, but they're selling these big trees, and I think now they're selling mostly professionals. So go to Golden Arrow Bonsai with Andrew Smith. I think he's really ethical. He came to ABS convention. I don't know if you saw him there. He's got trees that are reasonably priced, and you can take a tree like that and make something really good out of it.
He provided some nice trees for the workshops.
Good point. Yeah, he did. And they were reasonable price-wise. Yeah, I really think he's great. All right, lodgepole pine. So the Latin name, Pinus contorta, twisted. It's not talking about the bowl or the trunk. It's talking about the needles are kind of twisty. It's different on the West Coast. There's Pinus contorta, but it's Pinus contorta contorta. That's shore pine. It's very different. It's not a fire-dependent species. I'll show you a picture of it. In Colorado, it's 7,500 to 11,500, something like that. And it often grows with Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. It's adapted to a high-intensity fire. It's also a nasty species if you live in New Zealand or Africa. It's one of the most invasive tree species in the world, along with, surprisingly, Monterey pine, which is restricted to just a few small places in California, but they've taken it to Africa, New Zealand, and it's just going crazy. In Colorado, and I talked about snow as a driver and being good for ecosystems. So in Colorado, the Front Range gets a lot of snow, snowpack, lots of lodgepole down near us. I live west of Colorado Springs. I've never seen a lodgepole down there, and I think it's just there's not enough snow to keep the soil moist all summer. There's a purple dot down by Pueblo, and I think that's a lie. So this is what I mean. Lodgepole pine fire looks like that on the right. It kills everything. It gets in the crowd and it runs. Happens every 200 or 300 years. What happens afterwards is that. So you see the dead lodgepoles, but you see this dog hair thicket of young lodgepoles. You can't hardly walk through that. And what lodgepoles have are these serotinous cones. So this picture here, the cones don't open. They just keep growing, more and more cones. They won't open until they get heated. I think the temperature's got to be above 400 degrees. And that melts the resin. They open and they release probably hundreds of thousands of seeds all at once, and then you get these thickets. But what was interesting to me is that tree on the right with a little cone that's open. It's only 12 years old. So the young ones will put on cones quickly, and they'll open because the soil is still available for colonization. And I have a little lodgepole. It's the only pine I ever had in my collection that has a cone, and it's opening. It's not supposed to. They say they're all serotinous, but not the young ones. They're very vigorous. They have short needles already, so that's good for bonsai. They scale well, and they grow relatively rapidly compared to our other pines. But very few of them are like this one that Steve Varland showed in a show a few years ago. It's just an outstanding little tree. This is the one I was telling you. It has a cone now that's opening, but that one's mine. Weaknesses, it's hard to find one that has nice contorted trunks. It's slow to back bud. And it just usually doesn't have the deadwood like Steve's tree there, or that interesting form. That's the shore pine. And so it's a very different looking tree. It's Pinus contorta contorta compared to ours, which is lodgepole. And lodgepole, right, it's because it's straight and it's teepee pole. All right, this is Graham's tree, right? It's a really nice lodgepole we had in last year's show. So I won't beat soil to death here. As in most pines, you want to be really careful for watering. You want that balance of water and oxygen like Tom was talking about. Repot in early spring. As with almost all the pines, they really like full sun. They tolerate, lodgepoles do, summer heat really well, whereas a bristlecone might not. Let's see. And they tolerate cold well. I mean, they grow up to 11,000 feet or so. Where to get them? It's hard to get. You can get nursery stock. RMBS members who've collected material, reputable collectors. And I would say one of the people, Daryl, has some real nice lodgepoles. So if you're looking for advice on lodgepole, Daryl has some good ones.
I was going to say, if you just dig up the seedlings with a shovel in May, they grow super fast. So you can develop seedlings. You can get hundreds of those easily.
Did you guys hear that? That the seedlings you can dig in May. They're small, but they grow really fast, so they're really good bonsai material, and you could get a lot. You could do a forest. And like I said, Daryl has some really nice ones, and I'd talk to Steve Steve Varland, who had that other one. Who else knows lodgepoles? And so they're picky about soil?
Boone's mix is fine. They're really picky about soil.
Yeah, which means they're picky about watering. Yeah. All right, limber pine, one of my favorites. That's what this guy is. Let me just go over. There's 3 5-needle pines in Colorado. Limber on the left, bristlecone center, southwestern white is the other one. I have a hard time finding those. They're in San Juan's and further south, and they hybridize with limbers, so that's part of my issue. I'm like, is that a limber or is that a southwestern white? They have a lot of similarities. The needles, similar growth forms, harsh environments typically, high and low elevation, but the cones and needles are different. This is the only southwestern white I've seen as an example of a bonsai online. This was in the Artisan's Cup. But the 2 that we see most frequently are limber on the left, bristlecone on the right, 5-needle pines. And I always think of the limbers as looking like flowers. It's almost a floral look because the needles are at the ends of the branches. And bristlecones are called, some people, foxtail or bottlebrush because they have needles that stay on forever. So some of those trees will have needles on a branch that are 30 years worth of needles on one branch. Limbers are more smooth. Bristlecones have those horizontal lenticels. All right, Pinus flexilis, flexible pine. Todd Schlafer has a shirt that says they're not, but they're they're pretty flexible, but if you're trying to bend them and doing bonsai, you might break one. But that flexibility adapts them to wind. I'll show you a picture of it. They have these beautiful green cones, no bristles. What else? Yeah, often with Engelmann spruce, sometimes with bristle cones, both high and low elevations. So limbers are one of those, they don't compete well for light. So they grow at the highest places where there's no competitors. And then they grow out in the Pawnee grassland, which is weird, 4,600 feet, but there's no competitors down there. Let's see. And this is a low elevation in Wyoming of limber pines, low elevation tree line. I worked on a 5-needle pine working group with different agencies. We were worried about blister rust hurting our 5-needle pines. Like white bark pine is almost extinct in Glacier because of this blister rust. Anyway, poor guy from BLM in Wyoming is like, oh, I love coming to these meetings because all the range cons in BLM who are interested in grazing, they want us just to kill all these trees because it competes with grass for cattle. So I guess the bottom line there is if you want to go collect limber pines, maybe talk to BLM in Wyoming because they want to get rid of them. Different forms, like I said, trees have different forms. There's not one kind of limber pine. On the left here, that's near us. These pines are almost 100 feet tall. It's a pure stand of limber pines on a southwest slope with good soils. And they don't look like a limber pine bonsai. On the other hand, this bottom one's near Nederland where it's really windy, and that looks almost like windy ridge bristle cones. They're laid over, they're flagged on one side because the wind kills the branches on the windward side. Then this one on the right's from the crags near Pikes Peak, really ancient looking. And they often, you'll see this, it's a down limber pine, but it's turning into a raft style. You know what a raft style is, where it just starts putting up. So lots of different forms, and this is a huge tree. This is up near Nederland. They got blown over in the wind. But again, different form, more like a oak. Limbers and bristlecone often have, and I've not seen it in a bonsai too much, although this is getting close, these bulbous nabari or surface roots. And this is what it looks like when it's really windy. This tree's near Long's Peak there, and the one on the left, it's like 30 feet and just laid over. And this is what they have to put up with. It's just windy all the time, and that's why those flexible branches are really helpful. They don't break off. Do you know where that is, Larry? Yeah, you probably would. I said fire and limber pine. This is a place near Pikes Peak. Everywhere I've gone where I find limber pines, if I look hard enough, I'll find fire scars. And I think what happens is fire burns through. It kills all the adult trees, but all these trees in here are limber pine. And then the other thing that was really cool about this place, it was either limber pine or a shrub understory of shrubby cinquefoil. And the oldest trees you find are places where fire doesn't get to. That's the crags near Pikes Peak. These are little pines, but this is what we grow for bonsai, typically, if we can get them. Limber pine rarely gets the spotlight. This is one of Daryl's tree, which is really nice. You collected that, Daryl? Yeah. And then this tree, which is one of the most amazing trees. They're vigorous in terms of strength as bonsai. They have short needles usually, and so that scales well as a bonsai. Instead of a ponderosa pine with 6-inch needles that's this tall, it's a limber pine with 1.5-inch needles. And they have this patina of age usually. Here's some examples. Steve and Dan, the backcountry boys from Wyoming, collect, and they just have outstanding trees. This little one is probably this tall, and it's just one of the most impressive showing natives that I've ever seen. This one's mine. Weakness as a bonsai, it's slow growing, it doesn't back bud well. I collected this plant, it was about this tall, and I didn't know what to do. I took to a workshop with Walter Paul, and he said, cut everything off except for that first branch. So I did, and that's what it looks like today. It's got a ways to go before it becomes a great bonsai. I think I won't go into this too much. It's basically the pines, very similar. Some want more water, some want a little less, but it's pretty similar. Bristlecone's another one that I really enjoy, both as bonsai and in the field. I talked about the foxtail pine and how bristlecones keep their needles for many years. That's got to have an ecological advantage. I think growing at high elevation, they don't have to put out new leaves every year. However, and this is this tree on the right, once you collect it, you're going to lose that foxtail look. It goes to, having 3 or 4 years of needles and not 30 years. Yeah, they grow in the montane to subalpine, a lot of times with Engelmann's and limber pines, and the oldest trees in Colorado are 2,500, 2,550 years. And there's the bristles for which they're named. And the way to tell the difference between, there's two bristlecone pines. There's the oldest ones are the ones in the Great Basin, and in California, they're Pinus longiva, and they're up to 5,000 years old. But ours are not nearly as old. But the way to tell, you see the white dots on the needles? They're really rich in resin, and it exudes these resin dots. And I don't know exactly if there's a function of that or not, but it's diagnostic. If it has those resin dots, it's a Rocky Mountain bristlecone. Here's a range of them, and it's really weird. First of all, it's mostly in Colorado, so I think it should be the state tree of Colorado. A little bit in New Mexico, and one spot near Flagstaff that I wonder how they got there on San Francisco peaks. But that's a comparison. There's our tree on the right, Aristata, and on the left is that Pinus longiva. And like I said, they're killed by fire, but this is another place where you see in the back, those are fires there, and they've all come in back to bristlecone. No, killed off the Engelmann that were mixed in with them. And then around us, this kills me to see sometimes, but the miners just cut the heck out of these things. They cut them for firewood, and this is to hold back mine tailings near the Cripple Creek mines. As I said, oldest are 2,500. And we think of bristlecones as having this contorted, very much deadwood and everything, but these are old trees. Those trees are probably 30, 40 feet tall, and they're growing on good sites, and they get this big globe shape. So it's different than our conceptions. The young ones are like this. They look like Christmas trees, yeah. And then here's a sort of a series from the left, a good site with good soils, big round ones, a little poorer soils. This is near Windy Ridge, but off the windy part. So you get tall ones that are more flame shaped. And then as it gets windier, you get more and more of this. And this tree here is just hardly alive. It seems like it's knocked over. And that's also from Windy Ridge. And you see the ones on the far right are really laying down. And I've never seen other trees like this. Some of them just knock over, and there's one root keeping it alive. I've only seen it in bristlecones. Has anyone want to style their bonsai like this? That would be kind of cool. You probably wouldn't win an award. And then if you get to the real edges, you get these things where there's old trees that have died and then new trees coming in, but they're really not very healthy. The other thing about bristlecone, if you like wildflowers, it's a great place to see wildflowers. in bristlecone woodlands. So, strength as a bonsai, that's this tree here. They really grow well in bonsai cultivation. They have short needles. Collected trees can have great deadwood, but they're really hard to find. This is a youngish tree. It doesn't have much deadwood, but I'm trying to put it in there. But I think they have a lot to offer as a bonsai. Weakness, they take a long time to develop. They don't backbud that well. And then I wonder, Bob Randall had some bristlecones. He was a collector in the club, and he thought that if you bring one down to 5,000 feet, they aren't going to do very well. So I don't know. I live higher than that. I think Tom has some at, 65, and they're doing good? So, yeah, I don't know. That may be an issue if you take it someplace that's too warm. I won't go into this again. It's basically similar to what we've talked about for other ones. Pinyon pines, really cool pines, not very well utilized for bonsai yet. It's Pinus edulis. Edulis means edible. They have the big nuts, and you can make what is it? Pesto, thank you, with pinyon nuts. It's mostly in southern Colorado or western Colorado, low elevation, although near us they get up near Cripple Creek to 9,500 feet. It's the most drought tolerant of all pines, but again, if you put it in a pot, you better water it and not think you can go away for a week. Well, go away for 3 weeks and it'll be fine, because it won't. It often grows with other junipers or with junipers. And the oldest tree's almost 1,000 years old, according to the Gymnosperm database. It's a soft pine, and it's related to the 5-needle pines. They're all soft pines. So this is a pinyon here, if you come up later and look at it, and that's a pinyon in the far right in the big, 10-gallon container. But I think they have a lot to offer as bonsai. Oh, and this is cool. There are lots of species. There's 11 species. They're centered in Mexico and southwestern U.S., and they make up 10% of the total number of pine species in the world. Pinions in flower, open cones, and the other thing about pinions is they have these needle-like juvenile foliage, when they're very young, or when you maybe prune them back too hard, they'll develop needles like that on the right. They're easily killed by fire, although that tree on the right survived the fire. But they don't do well in snow. So this was from a heavy wet snow a few years ago near us, near Canyon City, and I went down looking at trees, and there were so many broken off pinyon branches. Their forms are different too. So young trees are this flame shape, Christmas tree shape on good soils. Older trees get this big globular shape, and the one on the right might be 25 feet tall. On rocky sites, they get more distorted, more bonsai-like, if you will. And I've also found them on poor sites, they retain needles for years. Like this one on the right has 6 years worth of needles on it. And then if you get to the really nasty soils, you get these kinds of trees where, in this picture here, there's probably 30 pinyon pines like this that are all, they look like those on the right. They would just make beautiful bonsai, but probably 1 out of those 30 could be collected, or maybe 1 out of 100. As bonsai, they're vigorous. They got short needles already. They have this great patina of age, but they grow slowly, and especially pinions don't backbud well. So that's one of Tom's trees, and this is one I collected a few years ago. So they can make really cool looking bonsai. This is one that I didn't bring in. I was going to, but I had back issues. But I collected this out of a pocket, and I'm going to hope to show it in the show this year. similar soil mix, don't skimp on watering. All the pines have sort of similar techniques for the most part. This is Stephen Lee and Paul Koning collaboration on pinyon pine bonsai, I think from 3 or 4 years ago. Ryan Neal has an approach to these. He calls pinyon pines an outlier pine. And he said, one time, if you have a really strong pinyon pine, you can come in and pinch the candles if they're looking like that, and it will promote back budding, but you can only do it once. Have you done that, Tom, or Adam, or Paul?
Yeah.
How'd it work? And is it because you're pinching, or what are you doing? How are you getting them?
I suppose so. I inserted the candle and had great back budding. I've also had off years where the tree almost didn't grow, and then a year or two later, it grows out juvenile foliage. It seems to be, I've had the growing points down, it back buds where light is hitting higher from the branch.
What's your soil mix?
I do use turfus.
There you go.
Smooth mixed with turfus, and my thought on turfus is I always screen it to remove the fines so that it holds less water. And I add in some biochar and some orchid bark, but otherwise it's smooth mixed 1-1-1.
Okay. If you didn't hear that, he uses 1 pumice, 1 scoria, 1 turfus, but he sorts it so all those fines get out, so it drains and aerates better. But good success and good back budding. Cool. Same kind of sources. You can collect them, get permits, you can get nursery stock, and then RMBS members sometimes will trade or sell material. All right, I gotta hurry up here. Firs. We have 3. Subalpine fir is one of my favorites. It grows near tree line in Colorado. Ours is, it used to be a subspecies. Now they call ours a separate species. Actually, yeah, that's correct. Ours they now call Abies bifolia. It's another one that grows in these windy places. So this is kind of Krumholtz. You guys know what Krumholtz is? That transition from forest to alpine. And this was a day I was getting blown across the tundra. But if you see these Krumholtz patches, you often see that the tops are brown like that. They're dead, and you're thinking, oh, the whole thing's dying. What's going on is that's the stuff that's above the snow most of the time, and it gets dried out. And so that's what's killing the tops. But those things will last a long time, and they'll actually move across the tundra very slowly, like 15 meters in 2 decades. But what happens is the upwind side of the Krumholtz gets killed, and the downwind, where all the snow accumulates, does really well because it's under the snow and protected. What else? It's found throughout Colorado where it's high mountain range where there's snowpack. So down by us near Pikes Peak, there's no subalpine fir. There's not enough snow in the wintertime to keep the soil moist all summer. It's killed by fire. It often grows with Engelmann and lodgepole, it grows with lodgepole too. So and limber. Let's see. It's got really short needles. It scales well as a bonsai. They're super vigorous in cultivation, and they have this beautiful silvery bark. You can look at this one here when you come up. It's different than a lot of the barky species. This is a tree of Adams. Do you still have this, Adam?
Yes.
How's it doing?
It's good.
But you don't see very many in our shows. I think yours is one of the only ones I've seen. It takes a long time to develop. I've had this one for 8 or 9 years, and it's getting a patina of age, but it takes a while. Yeah, here's a series of them over time. It's getting there. It's starting to fill out. So these guys, and this is from Bonsai Empire. If you have one and you want to get recommendations on horticulture and design and styling, Bonsai Empire had a nice page on it. Full sun, it likes more water, so I use more Akadama or Turfus. Repotting in spring or in early fall like most. Wiring in early fall is what they recommend. It's a high elevation species and you can overwinter it outdoors as long as you protect it from extremes and don't let it freeze hard when it's going into dormancy, so early fall, or when it's starting to wake up in the spring. This is Dan Wiedereck's little Shohin. One of the things I found is if you get into a subalpine fir forest, there's lots of little ones like this. I mean, there were dozens around that are easy to collect when they're young like that. They're pretty vigorous. So yeah, you can collect yourself if you get a young one. They do pretty well. This is one is on my list to collect this year or get a specimen of Colorado Grand Fir, AB's concolor. It's mostly in southern Colorado. Does anyone have one or grown one as a bonsai? They have this beautiful blue-green foliage, almost like a blue Atlas cedar. They also have a very distinctive shape, very tall usually, and they almost grow in pads, like somebody in the wild was making them a bonsai. They're lower elevation than subalpine firs, so down to 4,500 feet or so. And it's somewhat tolerant of fire. So that's the color. The only example I could find on the web was this, I think was from Reddit, and this guy showed a nursery stock tree that he styled as a bonsai. So I think, strength-wise, it's relatively short needles. That color is beautiful, but I don't think there's much information on growing them and styling them and keeping them as a bonsai. Let's see, and if it were me, I would just go with general information on AB's styling from the web. Like this is the same information from Bonsai Empire. And I found this, again, I was looking on the web to find out this was for sale and they wanted $75 for it. It's a nursery tree. Seems a little expensive maybe, but it could be cool. Doug fir, this was the one that is the biggest challenge for me. I can't seem to get them right. They're in the montane all the way up to the subalpine. They grow with ponderosas a lot. And the oldest tree is 1,275 years. It's maybe the most important lumber tree in the world. At least that's what I've read. Especially, for sure in the U.S. Tallest tree, almost 330 feet, so it's huge, rivaling redwoods. Near us, and I don't know if you guys see that up here, but the spruce budworms are really knocking them back. So this is typical of the area down by us with these dead and half-dead Doug firs. They have these cool little things you probably learned that looks like a little mouse trying to hide in the scales. Did you guys learn it that way? You see the little tail and legs sticking out. In the spring, I think they're really beautiful. The new cones have that purple look. Doug fir, typically, even the old trees are pretty symmetrical and tall if they're growing on good sites. I actually cored this tree. It was 475 years old, and I didn't even get to the center, so I think it was quite a bit older. And It was near where that tree, Lydia, you and I talked about. It's like 100 yards away from it. But I've been looking at this tree for years, and it broke off in a windstorm 6 years ago, I think. On poorer soils, they get kind of bent, but this is the same tree. This tree has a root that's almost as long as the trunk is tall, just like this big and just going across the ground like that. It was really cool. And then this is a tree that we talked about. Lydia has a picture of this, and I said, I know that tree. This is my son, and I tried to core this one. It was near that big tall one that's 475, and it's completely hollow. So I don't know how old it is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 475 years old. And then even poorer sites, man, these trees are amazing. I mean, look how thick that thing is, and it's, 5 feet tall? And then this one on the right's only like that. And in the wind, they get lusher foliage like this one here. Yeah, I can't stop taking pictures of them. So here's some nice examples from previous show. Dan Kingery's, Todd Slafer's, and I think both Dan and Todd styled them like bonsai, which isn't a bad thing, but it seems like Adams is a little more like a tree in the wild. I like them all. And I also need to pick Adam's brains because yours seem like they're more lush than mine. Well, they're way more lush than mine. I mean, yours seem like they're the healthiest ones I've seen. And what are you doing? What? What's that? And then this is one of Dan Wiedereck's bonsai. Like I said, what I've been told, and Todd told me this, I have a couple real modest ones I collected. They're alive, but they just look weak. The needles are sparse. And Todd Schlafer, who's a professional, said, I'm probably watering them too much. So if you go in the wild and you see ponderosa pines and Doug firs, the Doug firs are on south-facing slopes real dry, but if you go on the east face or the west or over the top, you get Doug firs where there's more water. So I think, well, I should water it more. And Todd's like, well, I don't think that's right. So again, you can't assume that's what is right for a tree in the wild is right for a tree in nature. Or maybe I'm just not using turfus. Blue spruce. Let's see, pungens means stinging. And what I've read is that just means that blue spruce, I don't know if Larry wants anyone to touch this, but they're kind of sharp needles, and it's pokey. Engelmann spruce are much softer needles and shorter than that. But that's a supposition on my part. The tallest tree is 180 feet in the San Juan Mountains, which is kind of cool. Oldest 600 years, and they can't tolerate fire. Blue and Engelmann spruce, frankly, I have a hard time differentiating them because seed cones on blue spruce are 5 to 11, but on Engelmann there's 3 to 7, so there's a lot of overlap. Supposedly, the young twigs on blue spruce are smooth or glabrous, and there's some hairs on the young twigs on Engelmann's, but I cannot see it, even with a hand lens. Don't think, though, that blue means blue spruce, because Engelmann's can get really blue. Just depends on the soil and the water. I actually use habitat as the main differentiation for me. So blues are lower, wetter, Engelmann's higher, often on slopes with drier soils. And here's some great examples. This is this one, right, Larry? So Larry's blue spruce is on the right from, I think, this year's show, past year's show. And then this is Todd Schlafer's. And if you see a bonsai, a blue spruce in one of our shows, chances are good that Jerry Morris collected it. He had a place where there were some outstanding trees. This one was one of mine, and that was a Jerry Morris tree. They're super vigorous in cultivation. I think of the natives, and Larry, you can, or Adam or Bert, tell me. I think it's maybe the most vigorous native in cultivation, the easiest to grow with the fewest problems. Does that sound good?
So we have both in our yard.
You have what?
Both types of spruce in our yard. And the Engelmann spruce does really well for some reason here. I don't know why. But they really like light because there's one in shade that used to absolutely horrible. Like it has like two trunks and like 3 live branches on each of those trunks, and everything else is dead. It's shade. So they need a lot of plants.
Yep, good point. So he has both species in his yard, and
And the blue spruce seedlings do fine.
yep. Yeah, I think light is real key for most of the conifers. As I said, Jerry collected a bunch of these. You can do them with nursery stock, but you need patience. You can get them from other RMBS members. Engelmanns, they are abundant. One of the things you'll see when you get to the subalpine is you'll see this Engelmann trees, but then you see this apron, and that's part of those same trees, but that's the snow covering them. And I personally believe that they photosynthesize in the winter under the snow, but often the most lush part of those trees is the apron down low. The other thing that you see a lot of times in this picture here is see all those hundreds of Engelmann saplings. Sorry, it's kind of low. Anyway, in Engelmann forest, there's often just thousands of these things, and they're easy to collect, and they make neat bonsai. I talked about the traveling crumholtz where it moves, dies on the upwind side and moves, grows towards the downwind side. They got that classic tall form. They were named after George Engelmann, early botanist in the western U.S. who described a number of trees. Let's see, the oldest tree, 911 years old. And at least down near us, some of these things are this big around and well over 100 feet tall, probably 150. Another thing, talking about models of bonsai, the young trees often are pretty sort of regular, normal, and the older trees, like the one on the right, the branching often gets chaotic like that, which makes me think, and there's an Engelmann at the back right over there, not in the really big pot, just to the left of it, but I'm going to try to style that more like this old tree on the right, if that makes sense. Another one, Adams. You still have this one? How's it doing?
Yeah, I do. I'm struggling with Engelmann's. I'm not sure why. But it may be the water, my water, well water, salty water.
So yeah, struggling with them, and I heard this on a Mariah podcast maybe where Ryan said he thinks that's one of the hardest natives to deal with of late, that and Doug fir. And I wonder if at lower elevations they don't do as well, because you're at 5,000 or so. Mine are doing really well. I mean, you can look at that one. It looks pretty strong, and that's only a year out of collection. But I'm at 8,500 feet. It's cold. So maybe that's part of it. This is a Michael Hagedorn Engelmann spruce that's obviously doing really well. And then here's what I was talking about. So you can go out and you find these places where the seeds just collected, and there's probably 200 little Engelmann spruce there a few years ago. And I think you have this one, right, Normando? Collected a bunch, put them in a box to make a forest planting. So here's what that looked like. Easy to collect. That probably took me 5 minutes to get to that point. put it in a pot. There's the ones I collected. I had this great idea. I was going to make a forest with 17 trees. I got halfway through. I got through like 5, and it was like 3 hours of trying to repot it, so I stopped at 5. But I collected this tree in the spring, I think of 2020, and that's what it looked like the next spring. And it just went crazy root-wise. And part of the key, and again, I talked about this before, I kept it on the ground, and even a month after collecting, it was sending roots into the ground. So I think the fact that the ground buffers temperature, and I think temperature is important for Engelmann, and maybe even moisture. Anyway, so that's what the root system looked like. There were my 5 trees that I could do without running out of time. And then just put them in a pot. I have my garage, I have cords hanging down to do forest, so I tie them all up. And this is another one, not the same one. So anyway, another thing about this is, again, you can take modest little trees. These are, an inch in diameter at the most, and make something pretty quickly out of them, I think, that looks pretty nice. It's not going to win awards for a while. All right, junipers. I need to get going. We have 4 junipers in Colorado. One of the commonest is Rocky Mountain, another Scopulorum, which means of the rocks. Montane to subalpine often grows with sagebrush, pinyon, ponderosa pine. And down near us in oak communities, they're killed by fire. They don't do well. So I think that's one of the reasons you don't see very old junipers in the Front Range, because fire's too common. The oldest known tree is over 1,000 years. Different forms, young, healthy trees on good soil look like this. Well, youngish. But you get onto worse or poorer soils, a little higher up, they look more like this. And then you get into really small soil pockets, then you get the ones that we like for bonsai. They're small, and some of them are collectible, although I would say junipers in general are very hard to collect. Again, if you're starting collecting, don't start with junipers because they have long roots. Some great ones, this is Larry's tree. I think Jim Lantis from Wyoming is that center one, and Zahari from down in Pueblo. So they make really nice bonsai. One-seed juniper, it's common near us. So in southern Colorado and then down into New Mexico, monosperma means one seed. Low elevation, often with pinions. Again, it can't tolerate fire. This is what I mean about roots and why they're hard to collect. So the longest roots of any tree are this South African tree. So 61 meters, 120 feet. But one-seed junipers are almost that, over 100 feet long, some of those roots. And this one, astounding, a 3-year-old plant that had a taproot that was 30 feet long. So you got to be real careful with collecting them. There is one up here. That's a one-seed. Let's see, different forms of them. Again, if you get into really poor soils, some amazing trees, but these are not collectible. The roots are just too stuck in the rock. This one was from that area, but it happened to be growing in just a pocket, so I could almost lift it out. Bjorn Bjorholm has some great information on one-seed junipers on the web. And then the other one, Utah juniper, Larry brought that big one in the middle over there, mostly in western Colorado. They're very similar to one seed. To tell the difference between them, you got to get a hand lens out or maybe see if the fruits or the cones are juicy when crushed or they're not. So the point is they're very similar. I tell them because if you go into Utah, it's a Utah juniper. Southern Colorado, it's a one seed. That's the range. So see there in western Colorado, often with pinions and sagebrush. There's not much information specific on the web, but I think you can treat the three junipers pretty similarly. This is Utah. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice to be able to put in a pot? And these are from, the one here is from Bonsai Mirai, and Matt Wright had this in the show, I think this year. Does anybody remember? Anyway, beautiful trees. Junipers, like I said, rocky, one seed, and osteosperma, you can treat kind of the same. They like full sun, well-sorted mix. It's surprising how much water they need. Again, they grow in deserts, but in a pot, you need to water them maybe more than you would pines. Let's see. I guess one of the things that you really want to be careful of, you know, when I first started bonsai, it was like pinch, pinch, pinch. You don't pinch junipers, you let them run, and then you cut things that are outside the silhouette with scissors. It's just better for the tree in the long run. You can wire them anytime, but heavy work, late summer, early fall is maybe the best time. Then this one, it's the last juniper in Colorado, common juniper. It's probably the most widespread conifer in the world. Just, you know, Palearctic in distribution, really beautiful forms, and it's similar to the one they use in Japan, Juniperus rigida. It's got these needle-like foliage. It doesn't get the scale-like foliage, the nice smooth stuff that one seed and Utah get. But they're just amazing in terms of the deadwood and the forms of them. But I've only ever seen the one as a bonsai in our shows. This is Steve Varlin's. And so if you want to do those, I'd talk to Steve. They're notoriously hard to collect. And this one here on the bottom is, again, one of the reasons why. It runs so far, and then I followed the root of this tree thinking, oh, that might make a good bonsai, and it just went and went and went. So, let's see, poplars. We have 4 species of populus in Colorado. Aspen's the one most of us know or think of as bonsai. There's a nice aspen Larry brought in, and here's one I collected this year. It's a cool tree, aspens are. It's the most widespread tree in North America, pine gymnosperm or angiosperm. It grows with lots of things. I've seen them with limbers, with bristlecones, with ponderosas. Some of the highest bird diversity in the state is in the pine or in the aspen groves. It's a clonal species, and supposedly, I don't know if this is true, but the biggest organism on Earth is an aspen clone in Utah called Pando, and maybe one of the longest lived. But there's a lot of trees out there, I think, that haven't been investigated that way, so I wouldn't say that's absolute. Here's some examples as bonsai. And from my perspective, though, even though these are Bonsai Mirai, are really neat trees, they don't look like aspens to me. They look like bonsai, and they'd be great, but for me, and that's a Mike Harine one that I really like, I would really love to see somebody grow an aspen forest with dozens of these little things to represent that kind of habitat. It's a broadleaf, so more water retentive soil. One of the things that you read a lot about aspens, if you want to get them to do well, you got to keep the container and the root system cold. So keep them on the ground, don't let them overheat on top of a bench, and also maybe keep them in a deeper pot than you would a conifer. A lot of people say, well, if you wire this tree, it's going to look unnatural, and I think that's maybe right. If you've got time, do it by clip and grow technique that looks more natural than a wiring technique. Let's see what else. There are tons of them around. You can get small ones. This one I collected this fall. There were thousands in the area, but I had to find one that had nice roots. So that meant looking for one that wasn't growing like right next to 20, because the roots are connected, and if it doesn't have fine roots, it's not going to survive. So I tried to find one out and away from it. A lot of people say collect in the fall, but I just listened to a podcast with Dan and Steve from Backcountry Bonsai, and I think they collected that middle one, and Ryan Neal has it, but they collect in the spring. So like I said, I don't know. It's an underutilized species, and I think there's not great information on aspen as bonsai, horticulture, design, as there could be. Todd Schlafer also has some really nice ones. Anybody else have good luck with aspen or have some nice ones?
Just in my yard, and I can't get rid of them.
In your yard, they're weeds?
Yeah. I mean, the sucker is just thousands of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I collected both in the spring and fall.
And?
And the ones I collected in the spring died, and the ones I collected in the fall are all good.
The ones you collect in fall do better.
Yeah. Yeah, fall seems to be.
I had one with gradual root and stuff, and then I went on vacation and it died.
Yeah.
I had it for like months and it survived.
Yeah.
And there's another one in our yard that's a root sucker, but it was connected to a little, about this thick trunk tree, and I dug it up, and then the deer ate it,
Mm.
and then it shot up on another little sucker.
Yeah. It's acting like an aspen.
Yeah, and hit it and fall.
Yeah. I think they have tremendous potential, but I don't think it's been realized yet, at least from my perspective. Hackberry is one I really think is cool too. Canyon hackberry, low elevation in canyons along the Front Range. It's called reticulata because it has this net veined look on the leaves. It's not a great picture. It's hard to get ones that show how neat these are. They have big muscular trunks. They're like this tall. That's a little better picture. In Asia, Chinese hackberry makes tremendous bonsai. That's the one on the left. This is a Will Kearns bonsai that's been in our show a few times, collected by Alan Hills, but it's a really, really beautiful tree. So I think hackberry has a lot of promise, but they're hard to collect. It's almost like junipers. Those roots go forever. There's guidelines in Bonsai Empire. And I had this great idea. I can't get one because the roots are too far, so I tried to air layer it. And I thought I did everything right, but it didn't take. The tree was fine. It just grew right through the cut that I made. So, and I watered it twice a week, and I don't know. Anyway, they're really beautiful. Wax currant. So I'm going to talk real quickly about some other alternatives. This was a plant that Dan had in the show last year, a really pretty one, so take a look at it. You know, a lot of times we're like, oh, we don't have any broadleaves, we don't have any flowering or fruiting species. Beautiful fruits. So if you had one, you could get fruits on it, would look really good in the show. This is one I collected last year. Some of them have great deadwood. This deadwood is like this, the tree is like that. There's Dan's. So I do a water retentive mix, full sun. The one thing that these do, as a lot of the shrubs do, is they're basally dominant, so they put up suckers. It's a pain in the butt, and you got to cut those off. Shrubby cinquefoil is another one that's really common. So here's an example you can look at. It's widespread in Colorado, but it flowers. And in the fall, for our fall show, you can get these to flower. If you deadhead them, I think it was the tree on the right. It was midsummer and it had lots of flowers, and so I said, well, I'm going to deadhead these and count. And I got up to 300, pinched them, and 300 flowers on this one little, I mean, the plant was only that tall. So they're really neat plants. They're very vigorous. They make great accents, but I think they can make great shohin too. Depends on your point of view, but that's this plant here at last fall's show. Likes water, full sun, deadhead the flowers. This is another one I've heard people, and I don't know if anybody's had success with mountain mahogany. They're really hard to collect, but they're a widespread shrub in the rose family in Colorado. They grow on these dry hillsides. Those are all mountain mahogany. And this is another kind of mountain mahogany, one from New Mexico, but they're really pretty. They have good deadwood. You can come and look at this one after, but oh, this is Mike Harine's. This is another species of mountain mahogany. He has some good suggestions if you do get this species for horticulture. But this is what I was talking about. So this is that plant, and it's basally dominant. So what happens is I'll wire these branches, and you'll see they're wired. But after a year or two, they die, and then it suckers. So if you look at that picture, all those little protuberances are old suckers. So I'm not sure you can ever make this into a bonsai. Does that make sense? In other words, I don't think you could ever develop nice primary and secondary branches that just die back. Has anybody had success with these? Doing that, or even collecting them? I think they're hard to collect.
Are we still on not mahogany?
Yep.
Yeah, I have one. I'm gonna collect this spring or fall or something. Well, I have a bunch, but one in particular I really like. And they get really fine branching, and it's actually really nice. And some of them send up a bunch of suckers, but if you get a seedling and you don't have the main branch off, like you don't cut it way back to the base, generally I found they don't send up much suckers because it just doesn't work.
That's interesting. I need to talk to you. So he said, if you didn't hear it, that, you know, if you get it and start it as a seedling, it may branch better and doesn't sucker as much. Yeah, I should ask you, and I'd like to see it. Maybe if you bring it into the Springs meeting, are you going to come?
I'm going to wait for the buds to activate it.
I'd like to see it sometime. Big tooth sagebrush, another plant that I think has a lot of potential. Linda Paul brought this one in, so check it out. There's lots of them. There's two species, actually. Big tooth sage on the left. This middle one is black sage, and I don't know if you went to ABS, but if you did, Andy Smith brought in a bunch of Artemisia nova, really beautiful, really small plants for a workshop there. They grow together. The small ones in there are nova, and the tall blue-green ones are Artemisia tridentata. This was one I collected a few years ago. They make great bonsai. That's a picture from ABS in the spring, getting people to sign up to do the workshop with Andy's material. They got great trunks, delicate leaves, patina of age, but the problem is, and Larry stepped out, but their roots are really sensitive, and every time I've gone to repot after I've had a tree for 4 or 5 years, it dies, just dies. Larry's had success, I think maybe Mike has, but my advice, if you try to do it, and I think Larry agrees with this, is that you can collect them easily, especially after it rains, but put it in a bonsai container right away. Don't put it in a training pot and think you're going to transplant it, because it might just die on you. Snow willow is another one that I think is a really neat tree. Not even a tree, it's a little tiny shrub. It grows in the alpine. This is an example. And it's usually on the ground like that, but has really beautiful, delicate leaves. It's basally dominant, and it may not, at least with my skill, be anything but an accent plant. Here's another willow. This is a Jerry Morris collected willow called the Bebs. It's a striking tree. And David, do you know where this tree is now? Sorry. Oh,
I have that tree.
you have it. How's it doing?
Good, I just repotted it with Todd, so,
And it's doing good, yeah.
I mean, it's got buds and it looks like it's gonna pop, so, but we just repotted it last week.
How big is it? How tall is it?
It's a big tree.
It's like this, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes.
It's just, yeah, I've seen it years ago. It's stunning, but I think it takes some skill. So,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. I think I'm going to just say there's a bunch of other species that you could try. There's just tons of neat ones that would potentially make good bonsai, but, you know, manzanitas, and this is a rabbit brush, waxflower, bitter brush. I think there's a lot of room to try these, experiment, but there's not much information on them, and I bet most of them are basally dominant and hard to deal with. So I think I was going to talk about wintering Colorado natives, but I'm kind of out of time. Maybe that's for another time. So I guess now we have examples of most of these. And, you know, if you guys want to look at them or ask questions, or, you know, Larry brought a lot of them in. I know some of them. Linda brought some in. Who else brought some in? Dan did, David did. So let me just go through what they are. Limber pine, this is a bristlecone. This is dwarf birch, Betula glandulosa, one-seed juniper, subalpine fir. Here's the snow willow, sage, shrubby cinquefoil, currant, that's a mountain mahogany, aspen. That's a blue spruce, a really beautiful one. Gamble oak, which I didn't talk about. There are tons of them, and they could make great bonsai, but they're hard to collect. Pinyon pine that David brought in, that's outstanding. This is skunk brush, Rus trilobata, which I see a lot and think, wow, that would make a good bonsai. This is the hackberry, right? Yeah. I forget what this is. What's that? Oh, thank you, Larry. I thought you left. Western hawthorn. This is the Utah juniper, Engelmann spruce, and pinyon pine. So with that, I'm going to just quit. Sorry to go on so long. Thanks.